You're listening to episode 315 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practices from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Rick Repetti joins us to speak about Buddhism, meditation, and free will, a theory of mental freedom. Hi, everyone. Before we begin today's episode, I'd like to mention that this podcast and the supporting website, discussion forums, our live online practice circle, and other services provided by the Secular Buddhist Association are supported by you. If you find this episode or any other offerings helpful to you in some way, I ask that you take a moment and visit secularbuddhism.org and click on the contributions button. There are many ways you can help, which are listed on that page, and if you make a donation, it's tax-deductible and helps ensure the SBA is able to continue the exploration of secular Buddhism. Thank you. We're glad to have you join us in the conversation. One of the quandaries philosophers have explored is the concept of free will, whether such agency exists, and what are the implications of it. This is not foreign to Buddhist thought either, as the relationship between karma and free will becomes a particularly tangled knot to unweave. Rick Repetti is professor of philosophy at CU New York, USA, and assistant editor for the Journal of Buddhist Ethics. His recent publications include the edited book Buddhist Perspectives on Free Will, also published by Routledge. So sit back, relax, and have a nice Darjeeling tea. Our guest today, returning to the podcast, is our friend Rick Repetti. Rick, welcome back. Good to see you again.
Likewise. Thanks for having me again.
So for folks who are listening to this podcast, you may recall that Rick was our guest in episode 261, talking about Buddhist perspectives on free will. And now we're going to be talking about his new book, Buddhism, Meditation, and Free Will, a Theory of Mental Freedom. And really, I want to have a build-up into what you're proposing, Rick. So why don't you start with what's the foundation of this book and why did you put this together?
Well, I guess it's a little similar to the previous book. The only difference is that was an anthology, a collection of a bunch of perspectives, not just my own. And this one is basically mostly my own, but it's also responding to all those other people, which I did a little bit of that in the anthology. But this is a much more complete, say, account of the ways in which my view differs from all those other views and an elaboration of my view. And both books really have the same origin. Originally, I proposed both of these books to Routledge, who published them, but they liked both proposals, and they thought we should go with the anthology first because I had a lot of big recognizable names in the anthology, and at the time my name was not so recognizable. So I suppose from a marketing point of view, they said, let's do the anthology first. We'll get your name out there, and then your monograph will be worth publishing. so that's how it came out in that sequence. But are you asking me the deeper question, like why am I working on this stuff?
Yeah. Why are you working on this stuff? What is it about in your studies and your scholarship? What is it you've found that makes you go, that feels a little bit off? How about this?
Yeah, now that's a much more complicated question, but I don't want to start at the very, very beginning because that'll push us into a lot more time. But I mean, I should say that I've been practicing meditation since I was a teenager, which is a long time ago, multiple decades ago. Let's just say that. And it was my meditation experiences that significantly led me to my career in philosophy, my interest in philosophy. I've had a number of different meditation teachers from different traditions, and it's sort of like analogous to my having had a number of different martial arts teachers from different traditions.
Right.
And these representatives of each tradition, they all seem to have this way of presenting their teachings as if those are the right ones and the
Right.
other ones are the wrong ones.
Right.
And starting out as a teenager and going through that kind of system, with like a guru types and this and that, and learning on your own that it can't all be just the way that this one ideology or teacher or lineage sees it. That's, I guess, part of the foundational experiences of me being in some way iconoclastic or independent, or not somebody who's just naturally inclined to swallow a whole ideology lock, stock, and barrel.
Right.
Because I've had a lot of encounters with different kinds of teachers and traditions, and after a while, you realize you just have to decide what makes sense for you.
Yeah. It's interesting as you mentioned this, and I think you refer to this in the book. There's experiences we have that can be very compelling. You mentioned out of body experience when you were
Right.
very young and meditate your first time meditating,
Right.
and how really that would have been very mind blowing. Like, oh my goodness, there's this. And if someone at the right time says, I have the answers to that. Well, of course, why would you question it? Because it validates your experience. And it's only through a greater exploration and exposure to other ideas that you can see that there's other ways of looking at things, there are other explanations. And this leads, I think, inevitably, hopefully, to a question of, so how do I meet this? How do I know this is so or maybe not so?
Yeah. So I'm glad you mentioned that. So you're right. My very first meditation experience was profound, and it led me to go out and try and find more information about it. I didn't hardly know anything about it. It was a kind of accident that I even wound up having a meditation experience. I was watching television. I think I mentioned this on the last podcast, but I'm not sure. And there was, a yoga class going on. So I started practicing. I was just a teenager watching TV. I used to
Mhm.
watch TV. If there was an exercise show on, I would do it, this kind of thing. And at the end, the teacher put us into a kind of meditative state, and I had an out of body experience just like that. So I went out and got my hands on anything I could about yoga and meditation, and a lot of the things that I read at the time made almost no sense whatsoever. These books were very difficult for me to read. These really dense yoga books, or weird books about Zen and whatnot. I had no reference for any of this stuff. And like 80% of it was terminology and ideology that I had no clue what it meant. But
Yeah.
within a short period of time, I found some meditation teachers. This one woman who had lived in India for a number of years, a kind of guru like character. And there were two others that were associated with her. And one of them was Ram Dass. And I had been reading his book, Be Here Now. And when I found out that he was working with her, I thought, oh my God, I hit the jackpot. I found one of these guys. And I was in a spiritual community with Ram Dass and these two other teachers for a number of years. And then these three teachers had a falling out. And I was a teenager. I was in my late teens, but I had looked up to them like they were, Jesus Christ, and I was one of the disciples or something. And that had a profound effect on me when they split up. It was almost like parents having a divorce, because I had great faith in all three of them. And everything that they were saying made sense of my experiences through a certain kind of lens, like you said. And so that resonated with me. And then when they split up, each one of them was kind of pointing the finger at each other,
Yeah.
saying, "Oh, the reason we're splitting up is because of you. No, it was because of you." And I didn't really want to lose any of them. And there was pressure put on me to make decisions by some of them. The one of them who put the pressure on me is the one that I just stayed away from. I was like, it's like they say about parents in a divorce. The parent who badmouths the other parents the most usually loses. So, I mean, at an early age, I was in my teens. I was very spiritual. I mean, I was living a monk's life, but just not in a monastery, because we had, satsangs, meditation meetings every day. And I was meditating for at least a few hours a day. I was vegan. I just adopted the yogic way of life completely. And I was forced to try to, stand on my own 2 feet suddenly and make decisions. So that really laid the groundwork for me being able to go against whole traditions later on and stand up for, even what I'm just not sure of. And there's a lot of agnosticism in this book. If you read it carefully, almost all the claims that I make in the book that are positive claims, like I think this is true, they're hedged with I'm not sure,
Right.
That kind of thing.
Yeah, and that's one of the things actually I like about your approach, and what I see in the book is one of the things that our society is not very comfortable with, in my experience, is that I don't know.
Right.
And it's okay to not know. That's an opportunity for learning. It is also, unfortunately, as we often encounter, an opportunity for some to say, therefore my answer,
Right.
without really anything, just because there's an I don't know, and that's not comfortable. Of course it's not. But that doesn't mean any old thing is correct. And it often ignores the idea that, well, your explanation is one, but it still requires us to know, how is this so? How is, as best we can, know this to be true, or maybe not?
Yeah, I as you probably know, because I see you commenting on my stuff every now and then, I spend a little too much time on, Twitter and Facebook dialoguing, let's just say. Hopefully it's dialoguing.
A good way to put it.
Sometimes it's debating, sometimes it's more better described as arguing or just even fighting, because people are very strong-minded in this particular way. I encounter people, even, I'm one of the moderators on a Facebook group called Buddhist Philosophy and Practice. I don't know if you're a member of that or not. I know
It's
you.
usually where I see you.
Okay, yeah. I just forget. I'm involved in so many things. I forget what happens where, because I'm a moderator of a couple of these blog type groups. But I find myself debating with, let's say, kind of doctrinally dogmatic Buddhists, because it's a Buddhist website, who insist on the literal interpretation of like one particular kind of Buddhist doctrine to the exclusion of everything else. And sometimes it's almost impossible to reason with these people. They will use the scriptures to kind of reject modernism, neuroscience, all these other things. Of course, there are limitations with all of these modern.
Of course.
But it really puzzles me how you could take a pre-modern ancient text as an authority over modern science. Now, I'm not saying automatically that science disqualifies the validity of whatever's preserved in these texts, but just to have that kind of absolute confidence that, well, it says it in this text, and this text is authentic, and that contradicts, whatever it is that's going on in your laboratories or whatever. And that this confidence, I don't understand it.
It is what I would often run into in discussions, and they may start as dialogues, but they would rarely end that way. As people listening to this podcast know, my degree's in biology. I understand how evolution works, and getting into discussions with folks who are supporters of creationism or its thinly disguised intelligent design. There is an association with an identity and a particular worldview, a spiritual tradition that says your science is not correct. Therefore, anything you may have to say is incorrect. And when I ask for particular standards of evidence and you provide them, then there's moving the goalpost. Lots of other logical fallacies. And my return is, and trying to start those dialogues with is there anything that I can say or provide that would change your mind? And I can provide what would be helpful to me in changing my mind. I'm happy to do that because I have a mind that's not written in stone. It's made of a couple pounds of tofu in my skull. It can change, and I can be wrong. But I don't see that as an equitable playing field. And that's often what the challenge is I'm happy to have the discussion. I want to learn more about why people think and feel the way they do. And there's a strong, I think, association of identity, personal identity. I certainly have it in my own views. And it's interesting that within Buddhism, which has a strong practice around questioning self, that this is nonetheless a very human thread. And so I suppose we should expect that in these discussions.
Yeah, but you did mention one thing that I also find is that whenever this kind of constructive movement in dialogue ceases to occur, usually what comes in the vacuum there is fallacies, changing of the subject, shifting of the goalposts. I like the way you put that. Often there's a redirection of attention to the opponent's motivations, as if, the benefit of the doubt should be removed from the authenticity or credibility or sincerity of their position because of what kind of person they are or what their commitments are. These are often very subtle, the way that they're expressed, but I keep finding myself identifying fallacies that people commit all the time. It's just incredible.
Yeah.
How that's 90% of my exchanges with people in social media is me seeing fallacies and lately just thinking to myself, is it really worth it for me to go down that avenue? Because when you point out a kind of error to someone, then they typically get defensive. And then it could go on and become a dissertation on how it's not that was an error, but all the possible ways in which it wasn't an error, this sort of thing. And it's just like, I keep finding myself thinking, I'm entering, there's Nasruddin, Nasruddin, the stories of Nasruddin. Nasruddin is, I don't know if he's a real character or not, but he's a kind of at least semi-mythical wise man fool in Sufi tales, kind of like a Yogi Berra mystic. Yeah, so there's all these really brilliant wisdom tradition type stories that feature Nasruddin as a kind of comical fool who has some kind of wisdom. So Nasruddin, his disciples find him outside the house at night, looking on the ground under a street lamp. And they say, Master, what are you looking for? And he says, my keys. And they say, well, where did you last see them? And he says, in the house. And they say, well, why are you looking out here? He says, because it's brighter out here. Yeah, so that's one of the many kind of funny stories that feature Nasruddin with this. You have to think a little bit about what's the implication, where's the wisdom in that. But it's like looking for love in all the wrong places, I've been feeling that way a lot about a good amount of my engagement in social media. It's misdirected. The intentions are good on my part. I can't speak to others, but the communication almost never works. Like, once in a while it does. Once in a while there's a happy exchange, and
Mhm.
you learn something or the other person learns something. But it seems to me that the bulk of the time, things don't really serve the purpose. And it no longer seems like right speech, so to speak, or right action from a Buddhist point of view. It made me think that, well, when I see something on social media that I want to speak to, what I should do is just write a blog post about it, because then I can just express my thoughts deeply on it, make a really good case for the view that I want to make, and then I'll put the link out there and people can comment on it and they can argue amongst themselves about it. And that's been something I've been trying to do lately.
Yeah, and you're right. You bring up a really good point about how there's this shift from having a dialogue that is based in reason and exploration and can be very respectful and sincere, that when that seems to not be going in a direction that is fruitful, meaning making someone think my way, and I do this myself, that there perhaps can be a greater awareness and sensitivity to my next reply should not be questioning the other person's motives or authenticity or intelligence or any of the things I typically then see coming next, which is, you seem to have an agenda. And there's and it's so easy to picture finger pointing.
Yeah.
I've done this myself, and it's not good anytime I have done it. I tried to watch that and change, because it doesn't help move things forward at all.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not trying to give the impression that you or I are more enlightened than most of the folks out there. And they're also bad. Because yes, you're right. We do it ourselves. We
Absolutely.
get sucked in very easily. So the phenomenon, it's interesting because it's definitive of the time right now.
Yeah.
So it's something really worth being mindful of and trying to figure out strategies, not just for kind of social media self-defense, but bringing the best part of yourself to social media and trying to figure out a way to make sure that you sustain that. And I started writing something about that recently, just trying to figure out principles that mindful folks could kind of keep in mind when they're inclined to hit that button.
Well, let's shift a little bit. I want to get into some of what you bring up in the book. And what I'd like to do is just start with some of the framework of what you have in the book on conditioned, the unconditioned, and maybe a little bit about what is meant by free will and how you're approaching it in the book.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the conditioned and unconditioned, because, of course, those are key ideas in Buddhism. From a kind of analytic, modern, or contemporary Western philosophical point of view, those ideas, they might be terms of art that Buddhists are used to, but from a kind of agnostic point of view, someone who doesn't know the complex framework within which those terms make sense, they're really confusing. And they kind of must be like when I first picked up Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance or something. All the terminology in there was way over my head. I couldn't figure out, what does this world look like that this author was talking about? Yeah. Or even some of these other books about Zen, like
Kapleau's Three Pillars of Zen, Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind.
All those books that were around 40 years ago or whatever, they were really impenetrable. So one of the things that I try to do in that chapter where I problematize the idea of the unconditioned and the conditioned is to show that those terms are not that obvious what they mean. They're almost articles of faith for Buddhists, in the same way that Buddhists who take these ideas for granted toss them around comfortably amongst themselves. But when a non-Buddhist enters the discussion, it's for the non-Buddhist something like when a Muslim would be amongst like devout, truly believing Catholics. What do you mean that Jesus is the Son of God?
Yeah, what is this Trinity thing?
Yeah, what is this Trinity? I don't understand that. How could God breaks himself into three? What does that mean? You're speaking about it as if it makes sense. Could you explain that to me? So there's that, but there are parallels between those ideas and the free will problem. So that's why I went into them, because a lot of folks who were writing on this issue of Western philosophy's view of free will and Buddhist and what Buddhists think about free will, some of the prominent voices like Jay Garfield and Owen Flanagan and others who I have in my anthology, there's no such issue in Buddhism. There's nothing like that in Buddhism, because there's no God, there's no self, there's no this, there's no that. So there can't be any kind of issue like that whatsoever. But really, there is. You just haven't thought about it. And so in that chapter where I talk about the unconditioned and the conditioned, it's similar to the kind of libertarianism. So I'm backing into this, answering your question, but it's similar to the problem, almost the mind-body problem, in terms of like the unconditioned beings in nirvana are somehow or another in an unconditioned state. And they get that way by coming to it from a world full of conditions. And so this parallels the problem of free will in a way, not exactly, but close enough to show that there are similar problems in the two traditions. The standard conception of free will in, let's just say, even pre-reflective Western cultural mindset, out of which philosophy grows and then analyzes. Philosophy goes meta on what we think. So the ordinary view of free will is what we call libertarianism, which, not the political philosophy, but the view of libertyism, so to speak. I have free will means that nothing conditioning me forces my choice, right? So, and critics of this view think that, well, the scientific model tells us that everything is causes and conditions, and all causes and conditions are lawful. It's like billiard balls. Billiard ball A hits billiard ball B at a certain trajectory, and that necessitates the direction of billiard ball B.
It doesn't go in a random direction, having nothing to do with the strike.
Right. And all of our neurons allegedly function in this way. And then all of the macro level things built out of all the micro level things allegedly function in this way. Like, you've got maybe one atom bangs into another atom. It functions something like a billiard ball, but of course, just the mechanism is structured differently, and so the causal influences are different. But the idea is the same. It's a mechanical push thing. And so bowling balls and bowling pins are bigger versions of atoms, and we're just really complex systems of little things like atoms and bigger things like bowling balls, all causally connected from the smallest level up to the biggest level. And so whatever it seems to be to deliberate and to come upon a choice, phenomenologically, experientially, subjectively, it feels like you just freely chose. But if determinism is true and everything is causally necessitated by previous conditions in accordance with laws that govern those phenomena, then your choice was necessitated from before you even existed.
And you refer to this as a hard determinism.
Yes, very good. Good catch. Yes, that's hard determinism. That's the standard terminology in Western philosophical discussions of free will. So there's determinism, and then there's the intuitive phenomenological feel of free will. People who believe that that feel is accurate are called libertarians. So you've got determinists and you've got people who believe in this kind of free will. There's a group of both that are called incompatibilists. So you've got determinists and free willists, so to speak, the libertarians, who believe that determinism and that kind of free will are incompatible. Because, first of all, if your decision was necessitated by things like billiard ball behavior, then that one and only decision was necessitated before you were born, and nothing you could have done could have changed that. Everything that you did, even if you did try to, in some way, shape, or form, change anything, that was also necessitated. I almost got the cheeseburger, but at the last moment, I fought that and I got the salad, right? So I'm above it all, and I'm weighing, health versus yummy, and I go with health. And the determinist says, yeah, well, that was all determined too. You're not separate from it. What the libertarian thinks, well, no, my subjective experience, my consciousness, that's what I know the most, right? If I know anything, I know my own consciousness. Everything else is inferential and based on theories and inferences and all that. But my experience is direct and immediate. And I have other reasons, not just because of the phenomenology, the libertarian says, I have other reasons for believing in free will. Some of them are religious. So if they do believe that there's a soul and that there's life after death and that life is some kind of trial that determines your post-mortem experience, then free will is necessary for there to be cosmic moral justice on the soul level. So many people who come from monotheistic religious traditions are libertarians for that reason, because they think free will has to be real. But a stronger reason, well, maybe not necessarily stronger, that's not the right word. Another popular reason for libertarianism is that moral responsibility seems to hinge on you having that kind of freedom. If it wasn't really up to you, what choices that you make, even any sense of local control that you have over yourself, there may be some relative level of up to me, right? But even all of that is ultimately not up to you if all the causal conditions are what determine even the little range of it's up to me that you seem to be in control of, right? That's what the hard determinist would say. But the libertarian says, well, no, it has to be up to me for there to be real moral desert. For me to deserve to be praised or blamed, it has to be up to me. And for it to be truly up to me, it can't be determined.
This has deep implications for Buddhist ideas around self.
Absolutely.
That if there's if, as we're saying within Buddhism, we're just heaps, and it's all process. And as we look, no self exists. And of course, there are different ways of looking at that. For some, it's very much an ideological, there is no self, and that's used to wipe away everything else. For others, it's no, what the text actually says is this is not self. There's not a self to be found. It doesn't say there's none anywhere in any fashion at all. Then these implications about if there's just processing and so on, how could there be free will is the question. And I think it's good to approach that as a question. How could that be so? Help me understand, because that can help folks look at their own argument and have to provide some, well, here's how that could be. And it might be a wonderful and very insightful explanation. And great, I've learned something new. But it does really bring up an intense question about, so whence the decision to practice, then whence freedom? Where does nibbana come in? How is that so? How does that fit into all of it too?
Yeah, those are all really deep puzzles. And I just kind of try to lay them out in the book and make some suggestions about ways in which many people within the kind of belief system of Buddhism who kind of accept the narratives around these subjects are really maybe in a way helping themselves to beliefs that aren't necessarily obviously true or even obviously doctrinally implicated by me re-examining some of them. Some of the arguments that are used To say that there's no self presuppose certain ideas, which, if you reason about them in a slightly different context, you can use them to argue that there is or must be a self. But the concept of what it means to be a self is also quite difficult to pin down. So, I mean, I don't know if I answered I laid out the basic incompatibilism, which is that determinism and that kind of free will can't both be true at the same time. The hard determinists say, well, science says determinism is true, so since both can't be true, there's no free will. The libertarian says, no, there must be free will because of religion and because of morality, and therefore determinism must be false, since both can't be true. Mm-hmm. So the libertarians typically embrace indeterminism, but then there's the problem of indeterminism, which some critics more recently say, well, indeterminism is also incompatible with free will, because if indeterminism is the case, then your neurons firing randomly somehow or another generate the mental or cognitive equivalent or analog of a kind of coin toss, and you can't control the outcome of that coin toss. It just kind of happens. So it's not really up to you either. So this randomness isn't going to help you with your free will. Those are hard indeterminists. And of course, the libertarian is the soft indeterminist, because they think, no, indeterminism works quite well. It's problematic. It's puzzling. How could you have indeterminism or randomness in the system, and you claim to be the author of your choice? So this one guy who's the most, I think, successful soft indeterminist, or he's a compatibilist between indeterminism and libertarian, free will, is Robert Cain. And he says, well, look, we don't know, but here's a model of how it could work. If there is a kind of quantum indeterminacy, it could bubble up to the neural level. And perhaps whenever you have a torn decision, whether it's from a moral conflict or any kind of torn decision, it's almost like two hemispheres or two different parts of the brain are in a kind of equipoised conflict, and that might generate the conditions under which this coin toss could happen, this quantum indeterminacy in your decision. And what do you call it? He says, because both of the intentions are yours, right? It's ultimately up to you. It's almost like the collapse of the wave function, but you're the one who does the collapsing. That's where agency occurs.
Right.
He says, in the very first time that maybe when you're 7 or something like that, or 5, when you make your first real decisions, you're forming yourself as an agent. He calls it a self-forming action. You're forming yourself it's a kind of bootstrapping thing. Yeah. So you're creating the agent through the exercise of your will. And it is indeterminate, but whichever side you fall on, both sides were parts of you, and you're constructing yourself by making that choice that you made. And the more you do that, and then it becomes kind of like the cultivation of virtue, whether it's in Buddhism or Aristotelian or Confucianism. You become a good guitar player by playing the guitar a lot, so you become the kind of agent that you become by exercising your agency in this way over time and whatnot. And, it's a little bit of a flaky model, but it is the biggest criticism of libertarianism for the longest time before Robert Cain came along with that model was, you guys don't even have a model of how this is possible. So that was the first model. And there's a number of other models that are similar to it that have come out over time.
So interesting hearing quantum is the new, it's magic. Anytime I hear the word quantum, as this just shows a fundamental misunderstanding. And when I hear about, the observer effect, I was like, the observer effect has nothing to do with consciousness. It has nothing to do with that. It has to do with the only way we can see something is to have an interaction, and that changes it. That doesn't mean because I can see it, there's a magical measurable change. It has to do with, what We don't know what's there, so we scatter some flour on the floor so we can see the footprints of the invisible man. It's yeah. So what I'd like to get into is, so we got this framework of.
Let me say one more thing.
Sure.
Because a lot of folks, like even you, were laughing when I was telling you this. I heard you chuckling a little. But let me say one thing in favor of the indeterminacy thing. The model of how that could work with free will is not all that compelling. However, the one thing that it would do, if even one neuron or one molecule in the universe was influenced by quantum indeterminacy, right? Then determinism would be false, or at least not universally applicable, right? So if you rewound the universe back to assuming there was a Big Bang,
yep.
Even if that was only a recent Big Bang in a series of endless Big Bangs and then big collapses or whatever, but just let's say we dial it back to the Big Bang. If quantum indeterminacy exists at all, in fact, it existed at the moment of the Big Bang because everything was infinitesimally small. So it was allegedly quantum fluctuation that even caused the Big Bang, according to people like Lawrence Krauss, who said the universe from nothing and all this kind of stuff. So quantum indeterminacy does impact macro level stuff because it's the building blocks of the macro level universe. That's number one. And so if we dialed it all back to the Big Bang and then hit the go button again, unlike a computer program, which would unfold identically each time, there will be different outcomes.
Yep, absolutely. And it's a great case against the hard determinacy, as you're saying. And I would absolutely agree.
It's a case against determinism. If
yeah, it's an example of this is why this is false right there.
Yeah, if quantum indeterminacy exists at all, then even just chaos theory, things like the butterfly effect and snowballing, you roll a little snowball down a big mountain and eventually it's a boulder and then it's an avalanche that could start from a tiny little thing. So, and we know this from chaos theory that the tiniest little change anywhere in the system over the course of a series of evolutions can create massive change at the macro level later on. So if you change the slightest little thing because of indeterminacy, it won't be that every single time we rewind the universe, I get the cheeseburger at that moment. Right? Sometimes I get the salad, sometimes I get the cheeseburger, and then it's a probabilistic thing. But then, yeah, how an agent can claim authorship over that still remains problematic.
Yeah, and as long as we don't take the quantum woo interpretation of because we're only energy, I can run through this wall. Like, well,
right. Well,
it doesn't operate on the macro level. And
this Tibetan Yogacara line of thinking that I've come across about walking through walls and flying and all this other. There's a lot of these weird ideas in this mystical trends within certain branches of Buddhism,
which I would love to see. I think you would too. I think any of us would. I would love to see someone walk through a wall or fly. That would be awesome. Please show that.
Yeah, unfortunately, whenever you look for a levitation on YouTube, you get these transcendental meditation folks, these TM folks, sitting in lotus postures, hopping across the floor, hoping that one of the hops will keep them in the air if they only get the intention right and they tune into that quantum frequency while they're 2 feet off the floor. Maybe they'll start floating.
And I'm hoping for them. I think that would be great. And this is an example of here's how I can be convinced. I have a very pragmatic way in which we can all agree, not just oh yeah, I can levitate, but only when no one's watching.
Right.
It's closed. Like, well, that doesn't work for me, nor should you accept my assertion that, oh, when no one's watching, I turn into a dragon.
Yeah.
Okay. So with all that in mind, then I think this is a really good segue of why, yes, there's a scale and there are examples that exist that can refute hard determinism. So where does that lead to then, and how you land where you land in the book. And again, it's a soft landing, not a hard landing.
Yeah. I forget where I read this. It was maybe a Zen story or something, but some fellow was on a long meditation retreat and he has a chance to speak to the master, the interview. And, he's reached a point where his beliefs are kind of melting away and his conceptions of himself, everything that he used to take to be concrete is now becoming very permeable and elastic. And so he tells the master, he explains this and he says, I feel like I'm falling. I have no ground to stand on. All the things that I used to feel concrete about are just ephemeral and, it's all becoming impermanent and hollow and empty. And this is not good. I feel like I'm falling. And the master says, falling is okay. Landing is the problem. So you said, where do I land? I try not to really land when it comes to this stuff. Like I said earlier, it's more about problematizing things and just, laying out possibilities. And and I say it's a theory. It's not my theory of mental freedom. It's a theory. And then, of course, a lot of maybe more committed Buddhists will tell me, well, it's not the theory of Buddha. It's not the Buddhist theory, your view, Rick. It's an interesting theory, but it's not our theory, And I say, yeah, well, whatever, all I'm doing is, and I say this throughout my writings, I'm not trying to be an exponent or a mouthpiece or an articulator of what Buddhists do say.
Right, and you actually, I do want to make a point that you make in the book for those who are listening, is that Buddhism is not monolithic. There's not just one, and you do make that very clear in the book too. So I just want to mention that for the listeners.
Yeah, there's not just one. That's number one. Number two, even within any particular tradition, there's different interpretations. And the history of Buddhism is the history of evolving interpretations. And I see my kind of radical, different, divergent set of ideas as part of that growing tradition. I'm contributing to ways of thinking about it, I hope. And I'm just trying to highlight possible directions of interpretation that I don't think have been noticed, that are interesting and important. And, you need to go meta and challenge everything. That there are no sacred cows. There shouldn't be, certainly not in this kind of tradition where everything is empty and plastic. All right, so where do I not land? Yeah. Well, it's complicated, but and there's a lot of different ways to try to go about it. But let me just say what soft compatibilism is. So, and first, let me say what hard incompatibilism is. So, the first incompatibilism was between determinism and free will, and that's hard determinism. Then the next one, when folks ran and said, okay, indeterminism will save us. And then the critics came along and said, no, indeterminism is also incompatible with free will. So that's hard indeterminism. And then the critics, the skeptics about free will in Western philosophy said, let's unite those two things and call it hard incompatibilism. Both determinism and indeterminism are incompatible with free will. If things are determined, you could never have done otherwise than what you did. That one outcome was necessitated. So if you couldn't have done otherwise, there were no alternatives available. Determinism necessitates a single alternative. And the word alternative doesn't even make sense if there are no other alternatives. So a single outcome. So even the concept of alternatives is absurd from a deterministic point of view. And so if you could not have done otherwise than what you did, you couldn't be free, right? So that's hard determinism. And then hard indeterminism, just reviewing, is if randomness and chaos determined or, led to the outcome of your choice, then it wasn't up to you. You can't control the outcome of a random process. If it's not up to you, you don't have free will. In both cases, it's not up to you. So whether determinism or indeterminism is true, the choice that you made was not up to you, so you have no free will. That's hard incompatibilism. So I want to contradict both of those views and say that whether determinism or indeterminism are true, you could still have free will. You could. So I'm saying it's just logically not foreclosed. I don't have a very clear model of what that would look like, but I think that the logical analysis alone leaves open the possibility that you could have free will either way. So let me lay out my argument for, I call it soft compatibilism, because soft is the opposite of hard. So, I mean, it wouldn't make sense to call it hard compatibilism, because the word hard was appended to these other terms to imply that the consequences of this are kind of hard luck for you people who believe in free will. So, well, let's go with soft, okay? Because soft determinism, by the way, is the view that determinism and free will could coexist. They're not logically contradictory. So soft compatibilism is really just the wedding between soft determinism and soft indeterminism. So the libertarian, who I described earlier, is a soft indeterminist. He thinks indeterminism in my neurons and whatever, self-forming actions and whatnot, it could be consistent with free will, even if the model is unclear. It's not obviously logically contradictory to think that quantum phenomena and free will could coexist. It's not as obvious as hard determinists and hard indeterminists think it is. These are logical questions. They're not empirical ones. Well, there's also empirical questions. Is the world deterministic or indeterministic? That's an empirical question. We'll leave that on the side, because the issue of compatibility or incompatibility is a logical issue, right? Can something be a round and a square? That's a logical issue. It's not an empirical one, right? So compatibilist issues are logical issues. So we already said what soft indeterminism looks like, right? That at least if the choice is not necessitated, somehow or another, my agency can interact with random processes and I can claim authorship of them in some way, right? Not that convincing, but it's a logical point. It's a logical point. Similarly with soft determinism. Determinism could be compatible with agency or free will. And some of there's a couple of different models of that, but one of them is by Harry Frankfurt, who says that, look, he gives a thought experiment where he says, suppose a neuroscientist plants a chip in Jones's brain. And the neuroscientist he calls Dr. Black, the Black, the evil mad.
The bad guy, yeah.
Yeah. And this is with future, cognitive science, neuroscience, artificial intelligence, computing. You can imagine that this chip enables Black, who's monitoring a screen, to know what Jones's intentions are and to see them forming at the neural level in terms of the neurosignatures that are being picked up by this chip. And suppose Dr. Black wants Jones to vote for the Democrat. And he's monitoring him. You would imagine that he's doing this with lots of people to skew the vote. But let's just pay attention to Jones. And if no bells go off on Dr. Jones's laptop that indicate that that Jones is leaning towards voting for someone other than the Democrat, if there's no reason to intervene, Dr. Black won't. And he says, but if the signal shows that Jones is inclining to vote for the Republican, Dr. Black will press a button which will intervene in Jones's neural firings, leading Jones to reconsider at the last moment and vote for the Democrat, right? And so Frankfurt says, suppose this is true. If it's true, Jones will necessarily vote for the Democrat, either of his own accord or by indirectly having his neurons manipulated by Dr. Black. So there's no alternative. There's no scenario under which Jones doesn't vote for the Democrat. But suppose that Jones does it of his own accord. Dr. Black sees no inclination for Jones to vote the other way, and so he doesn't intervene. So Frankfurt says intuition tells us, moral intuition tells us, that Jones is responsible for having voted for the Democrat because he did it of his own accord, based on his own inclinations, his own preferences, his own deliberation, his values, his reasoning. There was no manipulation from Dr. Black. He did it of his own free will. He couldn't have done otherwise because Black would have prevented him if he had even the slightest inclination to try to vote otherwise, right? So what Frankfurt says is, here's a case, however bizarre, it's logically possible in the future that a human being could have no alternatives, but it makes sense for us to think that he did what he did of his own accord and that he's morally responsible for what he did. Right now, the hard determinist says, if you can't do otherwise, you're not responsible for what you do.
Therefore, not free will.
Right. But Frankfurt says, well, no, I just gave you a case where somebody couldn't have done otherwise, but he is responsible for what he did. So these are bizarro thoughts that philosophers engage in. But that's all you need is one case to show that what was previously said to be contradictory is not logically impossible. So that opened up a little doorway for soft determinism. By analogy, your choices might be determined, but if they're determined in the right kind of way, by all the parts of you that we normally associate with your properly functioning agency, then it makes sense to think that you're responsible for what you did. Okay, so then in part two, Frankfurt argues in the second article that the kinds of things that differentiate between those of us who we might want to say are functionally effective agents and those who are not, is that a functionally effective agent is one who has meta desires or meta intentions or meta level or higher order volitions or desires and base ones. So I want to have a cheeseburger, but I also have a higher order desire that says I shouldn't eat meat. I don't want that desire for the cheeseburger to win out. I disapprove of that desire, right? I don't want to have that desire. I have the desire. Nature has given me that desire, or my previous actions have somehow or another, created the conditions under which that desire arises, kind of at the base level. But I can approve or disapprove of it. I can want to keep that desire, or I can want to get rid of that desire. I can approve or disapprove of it. And over the course of time, similar to Robert Kane with the self-forming actions with the quantum stuff, Frankfurt says over time, my meta-level intentions create the kind of person that I am. Because the kind of person that I am is someone who approves or disapproves of various base-level instinctive desires that I have, and I become the kind of character that I become by having this meta-level functioning, A, and B. Weakness of will, for example, is when my higher order volitions fail to regulate and control my lower order volitions. So I might have weak higher order commitments to being dharmic, right? Or following the Buddhist prescriptions for not eating meat and this and that, or whatever it is. But my desires at the base level are stronger, or I succumb, and that's weakness of will. But just like, being a good guitar player is from practicing playing the guitar over the course of time, we become the kinds of characters that we become through our own volitional efforts at the first and second order level, right? So an effective agent is one who doesn't have that kind of weakness of will. Maybe exceptionally they do, but by and large, you become the kind of person that you are based on the kind of higher order commitments that you cultivate over time. And so if you have the kind of will that you want to have, which is first and second order level volitions that are in harmony with each other, Frankfurt says that's freedom of the will. Freedom of action is different. And this distinction partly maps onto what empirical studies show a distinction between 4-year-olds and 6-year-olds. 4-year-olds say that free will, they think free will is being able to do what you want, to act on your desires, which makes sense, which is what Frankfurt calls freedom of action. You have a desire and you act on it. If you're in prison or you're in chains, you have desires, you can't act on them. You don't have freedom of action. But the 6 and 7-year-olds say that free will is being able to not do what you want to do. So you have a desire, but you're able to not act on it, because by that age, they know that there are consequences to just doing what you want all the time, right? It's as simple as that. So, but you put these two abilities together, being able to do what you want to do and be able to not do what you want to do, and you get Frankfurt's higher order, lower order model. Being able to not do what you want to do, you have to have another higher level disapproval of what you want to do, and it has to be effective. So you're constructing agency over time. But if it's done in the right way, even though it's deterministic, it's your desires, it's your values, it's your reasoning, it's your deliberation, and you're constructing yourself over time. It's, from a Buddhist point of view, it's your karma. You're making yourself into that kind of being. And you've got plenty of elbow room along the way. You're not necessitated in the way that billiard balls are. It's a different kind of causation. So, like I think you told me once before, the causation that determines the way molecules form a table is not, I don't operate on that level. I don't live in that world. Whether it's deterministic or quantum, I don't live in that world. I live in this macro level world where reasons and volitions and whatnot come into me, and I deliberate on them, and I lean one way or another. And the way that all that functions, the kind of causal mechanisms, if any, that are operative there are not the same kind of causal mechanisms that are operative for billiard balls. So soft determinists that's just one out of many possible different models, just like there are different models of the libertarian.
Right.
I'll give you the most prominent libertarian model for the quantum thing, and Frankfurt is one of the most prominent ones for soft determinism. One of the other ones I'll add is a kind of, what is it called, semi-compatibilist. Fisher is his name, John Martin Fisher, who says, well, look, even if determinism is true, the hard determinists are right in a sense that there are no alternatives. And so if, like, the strong view of free will is that you could have done otherwise, but if determinism is true, you couldn't have done otherwise. So that part of it is right. However, if the soft determinist is right, it kind of takes a little bit of both. The soft determinist is right if you are the kind of being who's reason responsive. So like Frankfurt's Jones, if he's voting of his own accord, based on his own volitions and deliberations and values that he's constructed for himself over time, if you're reason responsive, then you're a rational agent. If you're reason responsive, then you understand what moral reasons are. And if you're responding to them appropriately, then you're responsible for yourself. And that part of it is consistent with determinism. So he distinguishes between two different kinds of control. If you could control the outcome so that there were more than one alternative, he says that's regulative control. That's only possible if indeterminism holds, because more than one outcome, if there's quantum indeterminacy. But the other kind of control, which you could have in a deterministic world, he calls guidance control, which is soft deterministic kind of proximal local control.
Right.
The analogy he makes is you're driving a car. It's your hands on the steering wheel and your perceptions and your foot on the gas and the brake that are determining which way the car goes. But you can't bring the car to some place that it wasn't determined to go if the whole world is deterministic. But you're still exerting proximal local control. And if you're a reason-responsive agent, that's enough for moral responsibility. And most philosophers concerned with free will say that the only kind of autonomy that matters, it's kind of like, it's an analogous argument with the Buddhist who says the only Buddhist arguments that matter are the ones that are soteriologically relevant towards enlightenment, right? Right? That there's a kind of axiomatic idea in Buddhism that the only arguments or philosophical dancing that you can do that's relevant, that doesn't count as conceptual proliferation, which is wrong-headed, is if it's enlightenment oriented, or it's going to facilitate enlightenment or skillful means. A similar argument is in Western philosophy about the only reason to have metaphysical discussions at all, like about free will, is if they tie down moral responsibility. Moral responsibility matters, and that's what gives free will discussions a legitimacy.
Right. And where I see that has a bit of a gap is, and let's use this driving metaphor that's come up, is within the Buddhist view that you just described, is that's not relevant, it's not directly related to enlightenment.
Right.
Well, but what about, an automatic braking system by which a small child runs in front of the car? And if that's not there, you kill the child. Okay, so there's a non-volitional death. So in Buddhist terms, you're not responsible for that, but you chose not to install that system, so you are. So it actually is relevant because that impacts one's progress along the path of enlightenment. So where does that line come in? And one of the things I appreciate about...
That's a really good point that you just made.
What I appreciate about how you discuss this in the book and now is it's complicated. Of course it is. And to automatically say, well, we can't talk about that. We don't have a full understanding. We are not omnipotent. We don't know everything. So it is valid to explore and see what might be here.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad you mentioned omnipotent, because the idea that the Buddha was omniscient is also problematic from a contemporary point of view. What does that even mean? There's this kind of attentional omniscience, meaning that I've heard this explanation: whatever the Buddha directs his attention to, he can completely recognize and understand it. If you believe that the enlightened mind can have this kind of omniscience, even if it's limited to whatever it directs its attention to, that it can have this instantaneous cognitive penetration of anything whatsoever that it directs its mind. This forces you to one of the things I talk about in my book a lot: titanic cognitive abilities that are far greater than the libertarian's little idea that he can step in as an agent when there's quantum things going on and pick which one he prefers. They're both his. And critics of that laugh at that idea, but they don't laugh at things like omniscience or all these other titanic abilities and psychic powers that, nirvana is supposed to open to fruition in the enlightened mind. And I capitalize on that a lot in the book to, why are not those things being problematized by adherents of these belief systems? They'll criticize rightfully the weaknesses of some of the arguments that folks like me will bring up, but they are lopsided in failing to apply this critical lens to a lot of the ideas in their own repertoire, in their own belief system.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because we see that, you and I see that online in discussions where there's a criticism of secular mindfulness programs, as an example, that are run into on an almost daily basis.
Yeah.
That hasn't fixed corporate greed when it's taught in the corporate world. Therefore, all of secular mindfulness is wrong. And then I point out, wait, your particular religious tradition, whatever that may be, not necessarily even only Buddhist ones, has not solved those ills either. You're incorrectly presuming that there's a cause and effect relationship between mindfulness programs being there and the corporate greed, and that hasn't fixed them in the past few decades. Well, you've had over 2,500 years. So what's your excuse? Do you also apply this to your own tradition? And that's when the only response I get is cricket chirps. There isn't an acknowledgement of, yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, I don't know if you know about this, but there's an anthology of all of these kinds of criticisms put together by Ron Purser and David Forbes, and I forget the third editor's name. But almost all of the articles in this collection are critical in this kind of way. But I'm friends with Ron and with David, and I asked them if I could be the voice of the other side, and they let me submit an article to that collection where I think I pretty much, what was it called? Mindfulness Matters.
If it's the collection I'm thinking of, there are some really beautiful articles in there.
There's a lot of really good stuff in there. But the second
Rhonda's in there and others. And then I point out to Ron, it's like, Ron, you're very much, because Ron is also a friend, much as we often are at loggerheads. We are in quite close agreement on many social issues.
Right.
I will say, Ron, you're a frequent, and I'm right there with you against the social ills of greed and expense, and things are for profit. And this book costs over $400.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I know. I have the book right inside. Maybe I'll get it at some point so we could mention it for the listeners if anybody wants it. It's a good collection.
It is. It truly is. And there are some really insightful and good articles. And one of the things I do admire, this is not a disparaging of Ron and David, who are friends and also do terrific work. It's an identification of, yes, there's that too. And let's have this applied to all aspects of our lives, not just the ones that support our views. And this goes for me too. This is also something that I need to apply these same kinds of appropriate criticisms. And this is one of the reasons why I like having folks who do that active criticism, because they help keep things honest. And when there are disparities found that we would agree on are outrageous, that there is a clear identification and change from within, because just casting aspersions from the outside doesn't do so much in causing material change to happen.
I'll just say one more thing about that, and then we'll go back to Buddhism and free will, I suppose. My article in that book is the penultimate one, where I kind of defend secular mindfulness in every conceivable way, shape, and form. Mindful snipers, mindful, you name it. It doesn't matter what they are. I think they're better off if they're mindful than if they're not. So I make that kind of argument. And then the final article is by somebody critiquing my article. And mostly the critique of my article was to show how some of the things that I say are similar to what Jon Kabat-Zinn says, and then mostly criticizing him. And most of the criticism was just from a kind of Marxist ideological perspective.
Yes, that is often the agenda that is transparently involved in those stances.
Yeah, but just a really interesting exchange and a lot of really great stuff in that collection. But so getting back to the point of our discussion, so I pretty much laid out what soft determinism is and soft indeterminism is, and then soft compatibilism is just the unity of both of those views, so to speak. So, hard incompatibilism means that determinism and indeterminism are both incompatible with free will. Soft compatibilism means that both determinism and indeterminism are compatible with free will. Not that we have it, but that it's logically possible that we could. So I gave the hard incompatibilists' argument summarized goes like this. If determinism is true, there are no alternatives. There's a single outcome. You couldn't have done otherwise, so it wasn't up to you, so you don't have free will. Second premise is about indeterminism. If randomness and chance and chaos are what bring about your choice, then that outcome wasn't up to you, so you don't have free will. So either way, whether your behavior was deterministically generated or indeterministically generated, you can't have free will. So the flip side of that argument from the soft compatibilist just kind of takes these are both if-thens. If determinism is true, then it takes the then from each one and flips it with the other if. So it goes something like this. If your choices can't be up to you if they're random. Then if they are non-random, if they're determined, then they can be up to you. It has to be the case that if your choices can't be up to you because they're random, then they can be up to you if they're non-random. It's just a matter of logic.
Logically, has to. Yeah.
Yeah. And similarly, if the problem with determinism is that there are no alternatives, well, clearly it's a matter of pure logic that if indeterminism is true, then there are alternatives. So if lacking alternatives guarantees that you can't have free will, then having alternatives, it doesn't guarantee that you have free will, but it guarantees that you could have free will. So either way, if determinism or indeterminism are true, you could have the conditions under which you might have free will. So whereas hard incompatibilists say if either one is true, you cannot have free will, the soft compatibilist is saying if either one of them is true, you could have free will. Not that you have it, but that you could. Both arguments are could or could not arguments. Those are logical arguments. Compatibilism or incompatibilism, logical. The empirical issues, science will tell us someday.
It's not an assertion of this is so. It's a
right.
That is a possible.
Whether the world is deterministic, whether or not things at the quantum level are genuinely indeterministic, whether or not things that even are genuinely indeterministic can rise up to the level of neurons, whether or not the kind of thing that is a conscious mind can somehow or another, in an agential sense, interact with indeterminate possibilities, etc. Those are all empirical questions.
Yeah.
Those are all empirical questions. And it's going to be a long time before we have answers to those questions.
And that's okay. This is the getting to know, I don't know.
Right. It's okay to fall. And it'll be a long time before we land anywhere worth landing where we know. If knowing is landing, it's going to be a long time before we can really feel confident, even to temporarily land on a ledge.
Right.
But any kind of landing or certainty that I have, I don't even like to call it certainty, it's a confidence that I have in views, it's usually in negative views. It's in rejecting assertions that people make that they're confident about that I think aren't established as such. You know, I'm more like Nagarjuna or Socrates in being comfortable rejecting positive claims that others make than in making positive claims. And the positive claims that I make are about logical possibilities.
Right.
So what Buddhists can say about free will is much more important to me than what they have said or what they've been saying or what they like to say or what they all agree at this time in the history of Buddhism, consensually on some level, is reasonable to say. All of those things, they're all different kinds of things. And my focus as a kind of philosophical person is more on what Buddhists can say. So now that I've kind of said what soft compatibilism is, how does that tie in with Buddhism? One of the quotes that I make plenty of good use of in the book from the Buddha is when he says that he is able to think the thought that he wants to think, have the resolve, and not think any thought he does not want to think. He can have the resolve, which to my thinking is a meta-volition that controls a volition. He can have any resolve that he wants to have and not have any resolve that he doesn't want to have. And I extend this idea that I think most people who believe that the Buddha attained enlightenment and that there's any truth to any of this stuff, Buddhists who, most of them believe that he's speaking truly and he has this kind of metacognitive self-control over himself. It's a kind of total control over himself. So I make a comparison between that and Frankfurt. Frankfurt said freedom of the will is having the kind of will that you want to have, with this higher order volitions that control lower order volitions. Freedom of the will the will, volitions constitute the will, is for Frankfurt having the kind of will that you want to have. It's having this kind of meta level control over your own higher and lower order desires as per your values and your wisdom. The Buddha has that kind of control not only over his volitions, but over his thoughts, over his feelings, emotions, and to a great extent over all of his senses, all the aggregates, actually. And the argument that he gives in the Lakkhana something or other sutra about that he's not the aggregates. The self is not the aggregates.
Right.
Because the self is not this aggregate or that aggregate, because if it was this aggregate, then it could have it be such at will that the aggregate would be a happy version of itself in some way and free of suffering. And he goes through the whole routine with all the aggregates. And I argue that, well, implicitly, just like with the determinists saying, if you don't have alternatives, you can't have free will, that implies that if you do have alternatives, you could have free will. It's an unrecognized implication of the Buddha's reasoning in that argument, that if not being able to control the aggregates means that that's not a self, then being able to control the aggregates logically leaves open the possibility that a being, when they are able to control the aggregates, has either uncovered or constructed a self, a functionally effective agency. And if anybody has ever demonstrated functionally effective agency in their behavior, it's the Buddha or enlightened beings. Now, what the nature of that is as a self, I don't know. But I said, even within, Mahayana Buddhism, Nagarjuna makes the argument, not that there's no agent, but that the potter, the pot, and the pot making are interdependent. So by analogy, the action and the acting and the actor, the agent, is interdependent. It doesn't mean it doesn't exist.
Demonstrably interdependent.
Yeah, but it doesn't mean it doesn't exist, that it's not, it doesn't disappear, it doesn't vanish. This is the problem of the vanishing agent, as they say. The more you emphasize the conditions that are all the necessary constituents of our behavior, it seems like we disappear. It seems like that, but it's not obvious. And there was this whole tradition, the largest group of early Buddhists were members of the Pudgalavada, the personalists.
Yeah, this personalists, yeah.
Pudgala is the person, and they believed that it was hard to specify the nature of the person, just like it's hard to specify the nature of agency or free will for the libertarian or anybody else. It's something, but it's not nothing.
Right. Right.
That was their attitude. Now, I'm not arguing for their view. I don't know it enough because we only have fragments of their view, but it was a majority view in early Buddhism. Theravada is only one of the many early forms of Buddhism that still exists.
Yeah.
But Galavadins were up there with the Theravadins in early Buddhism. One theory I heard, I think it was Owen Flanagan, who said that he thinks that because from skillful means, it would be better for us to just advocate metaphysically that there's no self, that we would progress quicker on the path if we just adopted that ideology, that's why that interpretation became dominant. Because it's like a good meme, like a good gene, it replicates.
Yeah, yeah.
It works well on the path to just completely toss the self into the fire, rather than try to come up with some kind of nuanced understanding of the self, which is going to lead people to hold on to the self in some way. It's better for folks to just get rid of the idea altogether. Doesn't mean that there's no self, though.
Right.
But another thing I want to say is that in certain strands of later Buddhism, from Vasubandhu onward, Dharmakirti, a lot of these guys, they use a causal criterion for something being real. So everything, this is the ultimate versus relative, the two truths, ultimate level and the relative level. And like you said elsewhere, we're on the relative level,
yeah.
Right? And we're not omniscient, so we don't really know. But something is real if it has causal power. And this critique was used against the Atman, the soul in Hinduism, like the kind of Cartesian ghost in the machine.
Mhm.
If something is purely immaterial, the argument goes, like a soul, if it's a perfect little drop of God or whatever that conception is, totally immaterial, how can it causally interact with anything that's material, right? So that argument was one of the strongest arguments used to get rid of the concept of the Atman as a completely immaterial thing that's not causally connected with anything. What can it do? It can't do anything, right? So, but then that causal criterion, whatever can interact with anything causally, is real. I'm simplifying, and there are different interpretations of
Yep,
that,
yep, yep.
massively different interpretations. But it seems that if the Buddha is able to control his thoughts and his volitions, then he's causally interacting with them in some way. They're not just happening, right?
It's not just randomness.
Yeah, or are they? Yeah, if nirvana somehow or another, the universe is acting through you, then that really is very difficult to imagine that the universe is lecturing through the Buddha's mouth and walking his limbs and chewing his food. I make that kind of argument in the book. And the Buddha used that kind of criticism to reject the fatalists of his day. He said, did your legs just walk here by themselves? Right? So there's a kind of lopsided not seeing of these things that apply to the free will issue and the agency issue in Buddhism that traditionalists just don't pay attention to. So, and I bring those things in and make a big deal out of them. And I think that, well, from the Buddhist point of view, like this is the argument that I make. I hope you have another minute or two. But Strawson, in the earlier book, he makes the argument, the impossibility argument, which goes really well for this. He says that regardless of whether they were deterministic or indeterministic, that's irrelevant. Whenever anyone makes a choice, that choice is always a function of the conditions of the mental state that they're in at the moment of choice, right? And Buddhists love that idea because, of course, everything is dependent on the conditions present, right? But then Strawson says, and we can't bring it about that no conditions influence us because we can't move from the conditioned to the unconditioned. And therefore, for you to be fully responsible and deserve, praise or blame, you have to be ultimately responsible. You can't do that unless you could create yourself ex nihilo from nothing. Then there'd be no conditions. Since you can't be a causa sui, a self-creating being, you can never be unconditioned, so you can't ever be free. But in Buddhism, nirvana is the unconditioned. You can attain the unconditioned, in which case you can be free. In nirvana, mental freedom, that's why I call it a theory of mental freedom, all the work of picking these volitions to approve of and disapprove of those is to create the kind of conditions that will lead to you becoming unconditioned, escaping mental bondage into mental freedom, which is no conditions determine you. But then that's a kind of paradoxical mystery. Right. Is the universe walking through the Buddha's legs and chewing his food? It doesn't make sense. And I don't have the answers on that level. But the causal argument, all those arguments come together with the Buddha says, I can think any thought I want to think and not think any thought I don't want to think. And I'm not conditioned. I'm unconditioned. That's a model of free will. That's a model of libertarianism. And the people who believe in that believe in a lot of other greater mental powers. So don't laugh at the libertarians. All they think they could do is they could do otherwise. They could have had the cheeseburger even though they picked the salad. That's the limit of their great mental powers. All right. So that's pretty much my argument in a nutshell.
Great, Rick. Thank you. I want to ask, is there anything else you want to share with the listeners before we let you go?
No, but you can tell them that, my website, I have a lot of stuff, links to my stuff and, my blogs and all my publications and a lot of other interesting things that they could find. It's just rickrepetti.com.
Yep. And we'll be linking to that on the episode page for this episode.
Yeah. If you want, I will send you links to some of the articles that I've mentioned. and you can put them up also.
That would be wonderful. We'll be doing
Franklin
that.
and the neuroscientist and stuff like that.
Great. Our guest today, our friend Rick Repetti. Thanks for being here. Good talking with you.
Always a pleasure, Ted.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to hear more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. Sound editing, mixing, and mastering provided by the generosity of Anthony Dominello of StructureFromSound.com. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizen Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.